It was a summer's day, a warm, bright day in a city called Sarajevo. The date was June 28th, 1914. Not a day anyone thought would be remembered, not then. The sky was blue, and people filled the streets, waving little flags. They had come to see a royal visitor, an important man from the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. His name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and he was the heir to the throne. He rode in an open-topped car with his wife Sophie. They smiled and waved back at the crowds. It felt like a parade, a celebration. No one knew the darkness that was waiting just around the corner, hidden in the cheering throng. Suddenly, the happy sound of the crowd was ripped apart by a loud bang. And then another. It was the sound of a pistol firing. The Archduke slumped forward. His wife, Sophie, fell against him. A young man, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, had stepped out from the crowd and shot them both. He believed his country, Serbia, should be free from the empire's rule. In that moment, with those two shots, he had not just ended two lives, he had lit a fuse. The smoke from his gun hung in the still summer air, a terrible omen of the smoke that would soon choke the battlefields of Europe. The world held its breath, and everything began to change. The news spread like wildfire. It traveled by telegraph wire from city to city, from country to country. In the grand palaces of Vienna, the capital of Austria-Hungary, there was shock, then sorrow, then a burning rage. How dare they? How dare this little country of Serbia allow such a thing to happen? The emperor, old and grieving, was surrounded by generals and advisors whose voices were hard with anger. They wanted revenge. They saw a chance to crush Serbia once and for all. They did not just see a tragedy, they saw an opportunity. Their grief was real, but it was quickly turning into something much more dangerous, a thirst for war. For the ordinary people back home, in the villages and towns across the continent, the news was just a headline in the paper. A distant tragedy in a place many couldn't find on a map. They went about their lives. Farmers tended their fields, mothers called their children in for supper, and boys kicked footballs in the dusty streets. They listened to the grown-ups talking in hushed, serious tones, but war was something from the history books. It wasn't something that could touch them, not in their quiet lives. They could not imagine how that single shot, fired in a faraway city, would soon call their sons and fathers and brothers away to a terrible fate. The leaders of Europe began to send messages. Angry, demanding messages that flew back and forth across the continent. Austria-Hungary, filled with fury, sent a list of impossible demands to Serbia. They called it an ultimatum. They knew Serbia could never agree to all of it. It was an excuse, a reason to declare war, and they made their move. In the grand halls of Berlin, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, stood by his ally. He gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, a promise to support them no matter what they did. He was proud and eager to show Germany's strength. He thought any war would be over quickly, a short, sharp storm. But Europe was a web of promises, a tangle of alliances made in secret. Russia, seeing itself as the great protector of the Slavic people in Serbia, began to stir. The Tsar, Nicholas II, felt he could not stand by and watch Serbia be crushed. He sent warnings to Austria-Hungary. He started to get his massive army ready, a process called mobilization. This was a dangerous step. Once an army starts to move, it is very hard to stop. It was like a great machine cranking into life, a machine that only knew how to move forward. Each leader felt trapped, forced to act because of promises they had made years before. They were like men tied together, walking towards a cliff edge. Now the dominoes truly began to topple, one after another in a terrible cascade. When Russia mobilized its army, Germany felt threatened. The Kaiser sent a final warning to the Tsar, "Stop, or we will declare war." The Tsar did not stop, so Germany declared war on Russia. But Germany had a plan for fighting a war on two sides. It involved attacking France first, and quickly, so Germany declared war on France too. To get to France, the German army had to march through a small neutral country called Belgium. They thought Belgium would just step aside and let them pass. They were wrong. Britain had a very old promise to protect Belgium. For a long time, Britain had tried to stay out of it, to make peace. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, watched with a heavy heart as the war spread. He famously said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our time." When German soldiers crossed the border into Belgium, Britain had no choice. It sent its own ultimatum to Germany: get out of Belgium, or we will declare war. Germany did not get out. And so, on a late summer evening, Great Britain, the largest empire the world had ever seen, was also at war. A conflict that started in one city had now engulfed a continent. The call for soldiers went out. In towns and villages across Britain, France, Germany, and beyond, posters appeared on walls. They showed handsome, smiling soldiers pointing at the young men walking by. "Your country needs you," they said. And the men went. They went in their thousands, then in their millions. They were told it would be an adventure, a great game. They were promised they would be home by Christmas, heroes one and all. In the first few weeks, there was a feeling of excitement, of patriotic duty. Boys lied about their age, desperate not to miss out on the great affair. Families gathered at train stations to say their goodbyes. The platforms were a sea of waving hands and tear-streaked faces. Mothers hugged their sons tightly, trying to be brave. Wives and sweethearts promised to write every day. Little brothers looked up at their older siblings in their brand new uniforms with a mixture of pride and fear. No one really knew what they were sending their loved ones into. They imagined brave cavalry charges and quick, glorious victories like in the stories. The soldiers, packed into the train carriages, sang songs and cheered, full of hope and the bold confidence of youth. The train whistle blew, and they steamed away, towards the unknown. But the war they found was not the war from the stories. It was a new kind of war, a terrible industrial war. The cavalry charges were useless against the spitting death of machine guns. The armies dug into the earth, creating a vast network of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles, from the coast of Belgium to the mountains of Switzerland. Life in the trenches was a nightmare of mud, rats, and constant fear. The ground was churned into a thick, clinging sludge by the rain and the endless shelling. It was a world of gray skies, brown mud, and the constant deafening noise of artillery. That first winter was a shock. The cold was bitter, seeping into the soldiers' bones. The promised quick victory never came. Instead, the men sat in their frozen ditches, staring across a shattered wasteland called No Man's Land, at another line of trenches filled with men just like them. They were enemies, but they were also just boys far from home, cold and miserable and scared. The war wasn't an adventure anymore. It was a grim, grinding stalemate. The hope of being home for Christmas faded with the last of the autumn leaves, replaced by the grim realization that this war was not going to end anytime soon. The world had stumbled into a meat grinder. The war did not stay in Europe. It spread across the globe, pulling in nations from every corner of the earth. The great European empires called on their colonies for help. Men from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand traveled thousands of miles to fight in fields and forests they had never seen before. Japan joined the fighting in Asia. The Ottoman Empire, a vast and ancient power in the Middle East, sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Later, even the United States, which had tried so hard to remain neutral, was drawn into the conflict. It was no longer a European squabble, it was a world war. This war changed everything about how wars were fought. It was the first time that airplanes were used for combat, dogfighting in the skies high above the trenches. Giant airships, the Zeppelins, floated silently over cities to drop bombs. Huge, clanking metal beasts called tanks crawled across the battlefield for the first time, terrifying the soldiers who saw them. And there was poison gas, a silent, creeping killer that choked the life out of men in their trenches. This was not a war of courage and swords. It was a war of machines and industry where human lives were spent like currency on a massive, horrifying scale. When the guns finally fell silent after 4 long years, the world was a different place. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, had crumbled into dust. Entire generations of young men were gone, lost in the mud of Flanders and the fields of France. The maps were redrawn, creating new countries and new problems. The people who survived were changed too. They were haunted by what they had seen and done. The old certainties, the belief in progress, and the glory of empire had been shattered forever. The world had lost its innocence. And it all began with that one moment. A single act of violence on a sunny street in Sarajevo. It shows how the world is connected, how the actions of one person can set off a chain reaction that no one can control. The Great War, as it was called, was a lesson, a terrible and bloody lesson, about how easily peace can be lost. It grew from the pride of leaders, from old promises, and from a failure to understand that a modern war would be unlike anything the world had ever known. A single gunshot echoed, and in its wake, the old world burned to the ground.